A clip has been viewed nearly 50 million times of a congressional hearing in the United States. US Representative Elise Stefanik questioned the leaders of Harvard, MIT and Pennsylvania universities on their question of anti-Semitism in their institutions. When asked repeatedly, and these are three of the most distinguished universities in the United States, whether calls for genocide of the Jewish people would breach the university's harassment policy, the university leaders, rather disturbingly, seemed to equivocate.
Calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment?
I have not heard calling for the genocide for Jews on our campus.
But you've heard chants for intifada.
I've heard chants, which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context, when calling for the elimination of the Jewish people.
At Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct?
If the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment. Yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? The speech is not harassment? This is unacceptable, Ms. McGill. And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
Well, I'm joined now by Gary Mond, chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Gary, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Those are three world-beating, world-renowned institutions.
I know.
And they don't think anti-Semitism breaks their harassment policy, or it's a matter of context? How can they say that?
Exactly. When the annals of the history of anti-Semitic incidents come to be written, this particular matter that happened yesterday will be writ large. It's a totemic incident, and people will start to think, what exactly, who exactly are leading these institutions? And is this the situation in many other American universities as well? An American friend of mine told me today that she wouldn't have been too surprised if it had come from someone in California, but the East Coast?
Well, and Harvard, America's most distinguished university. I mean, I think Elise Stefanik deserves a great deal of credit for highlighting this.
100%.
And showing that there's just a poison in the American academic system.
Yes, I think it's the world of academia as a whole needs to be looked at. It's particularly bad in the United States, but it's not much better here. Although we haven't had quite such an extreme incident, there have been many, many examples of anti-Semitism on British universities. I mean, the case of Professor David Miller at Bristol University is a very important case in point of Jew hatred, which...
I took that up, actually, on a number of occasions when I was Leader of the House. It was raised with me as a particularly disturbing case. And that what's even more outrageous is that in this woke culture we live in, if you had called a man and he'd decided that morning he was a woman, you'd be absolutely carpeted in Harvard. But if you say something's anti-Semitic, it depends on the context. I mean, how do we get into that situation?
Because it's all a function of Jew hatred being one of the aspects of being woke and being extremely left-wing. There's a whole load of features of having these political views. For example, support for Black Lives Matter, extremist views on climate change, supporting Greta Thunberg, for example, being completely opposed to the way of life we have and the capitalist system we have. And going with this is anti-Semitism and Jew hatred.
And you're the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. How do the people you represent react to this? What are they saying to you? How do they want to see it stopped?
They're very much in this country. They want to see, for example, the mass marches every Saturday being launched by the essentially pro-Hamas supporters need to be stopped. That's one of the things they want to see. And they want to see legislation put through which is going to make it much more difficult for people to get away with anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Yes, because I'm all in favour of freedom of speech, but hate speech is not something that is protected.
Exactly. There's a clear division between freedom of speech and hate speech. And when you're actually talking about genocide of Jews, which is what these three American presidents are essentially saying, it's acceptable to say that Jews should be murdered en masse, it's horrendous.
And the weasel words of "it depends on the context" is just vile.
It's completely weasel words, you're right. I just think that this really needs to be stopped. If it can be stopped, then it must be, where it can't be stopped, it must be highlighted big time. And the main problems all over the world tend to be on the educational side. People are not educated to accept that there are peoples of other races, other religions, who we need to work together with and live together with.
Yes, but these are all woke universities, that they've all been running positive discrimination courses until the Supreme Court told them not to. So in any other minority, they would be going out of their way to behave well.
Can you imagine if these three presidents had said it's acceptable to call for the genocide of Muslims? Can you imagine what would have happened? Those three ladies would not have come out alive, frankly, if they had called for that.
Well, there would have been a huge uproar, and it is reassuring that this clip has been viewed 50 million times, that there's been a very strong reaction to it. Actually, before the programme started, Kelvin McKenzie, one of my panellists, was saying to me, this is something you must cover. It's a subject that does seem to have caught people's attention quite rightly.
I think that's correct. And as I say, it will be remembered for many years to come as an example of how anti-Semitism in 2023 went absolutely off the scale.
Yes, it's deeply shaming for those institutions and shows a rottenness in parts of our culture. Thank you very much, Gary, for joining me. Coming up, it's the cultural segment, but has political correctness snuck its way into yet another one of Britain's most cherished cultural institutions?